And I have been asked to speak about the multi-stakeholder model, which is a model that is used by ICANN as well as other internet organizations, and also to talk about stakeholders in general. And can I just ask Muhibullah to just indicate whether everyone can hear me clearly by chat? Okay, I don't see or hear anything. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So before we talk about the multi-stakeholder model, I have to explain the concept of stakeholders first, because I will be referring to them throughout my presentation. So stakeholders are generally people with interest or stake in an organization or initiative. And the interest can be direct or indirect. And those with direct interests are generally known as affected parties. And by this, you can think of as affected in terms of the policy of an organization will affect your livelihood, your income, your well-being, and if so, then you have a direct interest in that particular organization or initiative, and you could be considered as one of the stakeholders. When people talk about multi-stakeholders, it means multiple stakeholders, and generally more than one stakeholder group. So, as an example, more than just the governments being involved, or more than just the private sector, or more than civil society. Typically, at a minimum, it will involve 2 stakeholder groups, and generally, in terms of categories, in terms of global initiatives and in the internet itself, you will typically see the involvement of governments as a stakeholder group, civil society or NGO organizations, and these are entities that are non-profit, non-commercial oriented, as well as businesses, and these are for-profit from the commercial sector. And in particular, if you look at different issue areas, whether people are working on internet governance or working on sustainable development or poverty reduction, you will have stakeholders involved that are specific to the issue area. For example, in the ICT area, you will typically have the Ministry of Science and Technology involved, and you will have multinational corporations that are selling products or services, software, and other things. And I will give you some examples later. Let's go to the next slide. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this slide, can I have the slide with the categories of stakeholders? Yes. Yeah, sorry. So now a little bit about the multi-stakeholder model at a high level. So the multi-stakeholder model is a model for collaborative governance. It is a governance that involves the stakeholders. And the purpose of this model is to bring stakeholders together so that they can participate in discussions, dialogue, decision-making, and implementation of solutions to problems that are shared or goals that are shared. And you can typically see that when an organization or an initiative is multi-stakeholder in nature, they will have some of these attributes. For example, the governing body of the organization will typically have a multi-stakeholder composition. Or the community of that organization or initiative, or the members, typically would also have different categories of stakeholders involved. Or you can also see in terms of processes that happen at the organization itself, such as problem solving or policy development or decision making, will also involve the participation of different stakeholder groups. And when you have different stakeholder groups, what you typically see is also an attempt at balancing the powers and power relations involved, such as having checks and balances to make sure that there is no capture of the organization or initiative by one particular stakeholder group, and also to make sure that no one entity is more powerful than the other. An attempt to basically achieve some kind of fairness. And also accountability, an attempt to be very clear about who is accountable to whom and who is answerable to whom in terms of decisions that are made. Let's go to the next slide. at ICANN, these are the large categories of stakeholder groups that are involved. You will find governments involved, and they can be agencies of specific countries, such as ministries or public sector specific departments. But you will also find intergovernmental organizations observing and participating, and UN agencies, and these fall under the category of governments. Then you will also see businesses involved. They may be small or large businesses, and you can divide them into two categories. Basically, companies that are users of the internet. For example, Facebook and Google are users of the internet, and they are participating at ICANN. But there are also businesses that are fundamental to the domain name system, such as the registries and the registrars. These are organizations or businesses that form the domain name industry, and it is encouraged and perhaps required for them to participate at ICANN because they tend to have contracts with ICANN, and in terms of policy development that's developed at ICANN, those policies on generic top-level domains affect their well-being, so they are a stakeholder and they need to be present. In terms of civil society organization, you will find NGOs, think tank, non-commercial users participating either as individuals or as groups or legal entities. You have end users. These are individual internet users like you and me participating because we are interested. We think ICANN is an important organization and the policies that ICANN makes is important, and so we would like to have our voice factored in its decision-making process. And then the technical community, which is really important because anything related to the internet, their participation is really necessary, and their knowledge is important to make sure that the internet works and can be used. And so these are the people who come together, and they could be protocol developers, equipment and software developers, network operators, technical researchers, and they are participating at ICANN. And finally, the category of researchers and academics. You find professors, students participating for their own research and also contributing knowledge and expertise. Let's go to the next slide. So the multi-stakeholder approach, where you bring in different stakeholder groups together to solve problems or to deliver certain services worldwide, is not a new idea. It's been around for a while, and there are many, many organizations that are working in their own area, solving their own set of problems using the multi-stakeholder approach. Such as in the area of sustainable development, you will find the Forest Stewardship Council or the Marine Stewardship Council. For poverty reduction, you can have the Microcredit Summit campaign. You can have the Global Alliances for Vaccines and Immunization in terms of health. Many areas, and this is just a small subsection of the multi-stakeholder initiatives that exist in the world today. And the point that I want to convey to you is that these entities exist to address complex challenges and complex needs. If all these problems could be solved by governments and through regulation, it would have been done already, but that is not the case, and governments cannot address these problems alone because they're too complicated, and that requires the participation of all the stakeholders that I've talked about. And that's why the multi-stakeholder approach is viable and why multi-stakeholder initiatives exist in the world today. And the thing I want you to remember is that while they all adopt the multi-stakeholder approach, each one of them does it differently. And ICANN has its own way of adopting and practicing the multi-stakeholder model. Let's go to the next slide. So the multi-stakeholder environment is typically very complex, and in order to explore it in a way that's understandable, we're going to look at the components of the ICANN ecosystem one by one. And I would start with the community. And here I just want you to know that in the ICANN ecosystem, we've categorized the entities into the community, which has the largest participation, containing different stakeholder groups. We have the board, which is the governing body of ICANN, and we have what they call the organization, which is essentially the staff or the employees of ICANN. So we'll start with the community. Let's go to the next slide. So this is how the ICANN community is organized. The ICANN community is organized into stakeholder groups, specifically 7 structures. 3 of them are supporting organizations, and supporting organizations have the task of anchoring policy development. And there are 3 different types, and I will go through them a bit later. There is also 4 advisory committees, and the task of the advisory committees is to advise the ICANN community and the board in particular about the policies that are coming up from the supporting organizations itself. If you look at the top left, you will see the Governmental Advisory Committee. This is the home of all the government entities that participate at ICANN. And next to it is the Country Code Name Supporting Organization. This is the entity that houses the country code top-level domain operators and managers. For example, I am from Malaysia, and the country code for my country is .my. And so the CCTLD, or Country Code Top-Level Domain Manager for .my, participates at ICANN under this structure. Next to it is the Generic Name Supporting Organization. This is the organization that develops policies specific to generic top-level domains, such as .com, .info, .edu, .guru, .photography, and the GNSO, or the Generic Name Supporting Organization, is very diverse. You can see that I've put an M next to this organization, as well as an M next to the CCNSO, Country Code Name Supporting Organization. That is an indication that these bodies are multi-stakeholder in nature as well, in terms of their composition. And within the Generic Name Supporting Organization, for example, you will have commercial entities as well as non-commercial entities that are participating in the development of policies related to their respective areas. Now, if you look down at the bottom layer, on the far left, you will see the at-large community. And this is the community that houses the individual internet users, like you or me or anyone who considers themselves just as an individual internet user and want to participate in ICANN. The address supporting organization next to it is a home for the entities that participate in the development of IP address policies. And those policies are developed regionally, and then they are transferred to ICANN to be ratified as global policies on numbers. Next to it is the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. This is a technical body. They advise the board and the ICANN community about all aspects related to the security and stability of the domain name system. And finally, the Root Server System Advisory Committee does the same, which is to advise the board and the community about all aspects that pertain to the root server system. So let's go to the next slide. So this is a slide about multi-stakeholder policy development. And if you recall, I just said that the supporting organizations at ICANN, and there are 3 of them, are responsible for driving the development of policies bottom up, and that is open and involves everyone who is interested in participating through working groups. And the 3 areas developed are the GTLD policies, that stands for the Generic Top-Level Domain, or the CCTLD policies, Country Code Top-Level Domain policies, and IP address policies, the Internet Protocol Address policies. And I will show you an example next, but essentially I just want you to remember that different types of policies are developed at ICANN, and they are anchored by different organizations, the supporting organizations that I mentioned before, and the process of policy development is actually open. And ideally it involves all the affected parties, meaning that if that policy issue area affects you, it's important that your perspective is represented in there. It may mean that you personally may not be there, but someone is there to actually channel the perspective of how you are affected as a group. And that would certainly help the quality of the policies that are developed. Let's go to the next slide. So this is an example of a policy development process for generic top-level domains. It's an extensive process with clear steps. And what I want to highlight is the red circles. I've marked these as red because I want to highlight that in the process of policy development, at various stages, what is developed is put out for public comments. It's really important that we gather comments from all around the world and not just limited to the ICANN ecosystem or those who are engaged actively in ICANN itself. So the process is considered to be open. It's bottom-up, meaning that the input comes from everyone. And there are multiple calls for public comments, so that even if you miss the first chance, you still get another chance to provide your input. So that when the board votes whether or not it approves or ratifies a certain policy recommendation that comes from the supporting organizations, the board is informed by the public view. And essentially this is important because one of the roles of the ICANN board is to ensure that the policies and actions of ICANN serves the global public interest. And policies are developed at ICANN and it is then implemented. And eventually there are other policies that are developed and would take into account the impact of the previous policies and the implementation of it. Let's go to the next slide. So now we come to the ICANN Board of Directors. And the ICANN Board of Directors is the governing body for ICANN. It's responsible for making decisions. Specifically, we are responsible for overseeing the strategy and operations of ICANN itself. We approve the bottom-up policy recommendations that come from the supporting organizations with input from various parts of the stakeholder group. And we consider advice from advisory committees. For example, the governmental advisory committees sometimes give advice to the board that they do not agree with policies that are coming up from the supporting organization. And the board has to address that and to figure out how to address the needs of public policy that's coming from the governments vis-a-vis the policies that are coming up bottom-up that involves everyone. And in general, as I said before, the board has the mandate of serving the global public interest. If you look at the composition of the board, which is trying to be represented here on the slide, there are 20 members. Our bylaws or our constitution requires that every region is represented. They say that every region should not have more than 5 board members. And there are 16 voting directors, and these voting directors are selected by different entities. For example, the nominating committee has a process where they make a call for those who are interested in becoming board members, and there is a criteria in terms of qualification, and they vet them. And then they would select a few, and then they would send them to the ICANN board, and each board member would serve for a term of 3 years. And if they are interested in extending it, then they have to resubmit for an application again. And then the other board members are elected from the various stakeholder groups that are part of ICANN. For myself, I was elected by the At-Large Advisory Committee, which is the community of individual internet end users. And then there are others who are elected or selected by the supporting organizations. For example, the country code name supporting organization sends 2 board members to the board. The address supporting organization selects 2 as well, and the generic name supporting organization sends 2 to the board as well. And then we have liaisons from the technical bodies. We have the Root Server System Advisory Committee sending 1 technical liaison, Security and Stability Advisory Committee sending 1 liaison as well, and the Internet Engineering Task Force has a liaison on the ICANN board. And the Government Advisory Committee is a liaison on the ICANN board with no voting rights. And that is because it is quite important. ICANN is set up as an entity that is not government driven. The government provides advice, and advice related to public policy is taken very seriously, but essentially it is a private sector initiative. It doesn't mean that it is a business initiative, because ICANN is a non-profit organization, but it means that the government doesn't have the ultimate say. And in terms of the male-female ratio, and I wanted to flag this because I think we need to work very hard to increase gender diversity in ICANN across the board. Generally, we have a ratio of 1 female to 4 males, and I think that this can be improved moving forward. Let's go to the next slide. Now remember when I said that in a multi-stakeholder organization with different stakeholder group, there's always power dynamics and power relations, and so we need to have a check and balance to make sure that no one entity is overpowerful and their actions cannot be accounted for. And in ICANN, there is the ICANN empowered community. So the community that I introduced to you before has certain powers that are granted to them and embedded in our bylaws or our constitution. This provides a check and balance to make sure that the ICANN board and the ICANN organization are doing what we're supposed to be doing and we're not exceeding our mandate and powers. As an example, part of the power involves rejecting the ICANN budget if it's not reasonable, and even recalling individual board members or the entire ICANN board if it is behaving in an irresponsible manner. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of the ICANN organization or staff, their role is to support, to coordinate, and to implement, basically taking the policy decisions and executing them. There are about almost 400 people employed across 34 countries. They are in every region, although there's more concentration in some regions over others. And the staff speak about 54 different languages, and in terms of gender ratio, we have overall more women than men. Let's go to the next slide. These are some of the desired characteristics of the multi-stakeholder approach. Not every organization are in the position of achieving this because it is an ideal, and I would just like to flag it very briefly. So the multi-stakeholder approach is meant to be bottom-up and stakeholder-driven. And ideally, the stakeholders are responsible in checking for gaps on missing perspectives and looking around and saying who is missing in terms of this discussion, who is affected but not present and not represented. And then they look for ways to rectify that so that they get the necessary input to develop quality policies. Another characteristic of the multi-stakeholder approach is that it needs to be consensus-based. It means that people need to agree, even though not everyone benefits from the policy that comes up, but the decisions the issues have been discussed and the decisions are acceptable with widespread support, with an understanding of the impact of the decision itself. And there's no strong or reasoned opposition. And consensus is important as a barrier to capture from one particular interest or whatever it is, because you need everyone to generally agree. Another characteristic is that it must be open. Anyone who's interested and can contribute can participate. It's inclusive and supportive of diversity. This is a process. And this is important because we want to be effective at solving problems at the global level. And the solution for one part of the world may not work for another part of the world, and that's why it's important to be able to include everyone. Now, the world realistically cannot be fully present. I mean, otherwise you'd have to have a meeting facility that can handle billions of people, and that's not realistic. But the interests or perspectives of groups of internet users or companies that use the internet or operate the internet can be represented by a subsection of the population. And then the attempt to strive for fairness, because it is a multi-stakeholder environment, there are different stakeholder groups involved, not everyone can win all the time, but to make sure that there is fairness in the process itself. And it's not the same as equality, meaning that equality means everyone gets the same. What we strive for is equity, sort of people get what they need in a reasonable way and having been discussed with everyone else, and everyone generally agrees, even though there may be some dissent, but it's discussed and everyone agrees that this is the right way forward. Let's go to the next slide. This is a continuation of the desired characteristics of the multi-stakeholder approach. It needs to be transparent. And part of accountability is to have transparency. And that means there are documented processes. Generally, processes follow agreed procedures. The decisions that are made are explained and can be explained, and they are accessible. And also the process and the entities that are involved are accountable. Generally, that means decisions and decision-making processes are justifiable, and there are mechanisms of review and redress, meaning that if someone were to come forward and say, we think that this policy affects us poorly or is unfair, and can prove it with facts, then there is a means of going back to review the case and then to see whether some remedy can be done. And then there's also the checks and balances of power that I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, supportive of meaningful participation. Internet governance involves technicality, and to be participating in organizations like ICANN, knowledge is required. You have to invest quite a bit of time to understand the issues in order to be able to participate meaningfully. Otherwise, you're just at a meeting and you can't say anything because you don't fully understand, and sometimes you lack the vocabulary to be able to make an effective intervention. And so capacity building initiatives are really important to help and to support meaningful participation. And also to seek to involve those who are present and to help them become more effective. And finally, flexible, meaning that the process or the organization is future-oriented and able to accommodate change. For example, ICANN meetings have grown to such a level that we've hit more than 3,000 participants, and that's big. And if it grows even more, there are very few conference facilities that can actually accommodate all these participants itself, and that's something that we have to figure out in terms of how to address that in the future. Let's go to the next slide. Right, I've been asked to talk a little bit about how people who don't know ICANN well can get involved. And getting to know ICANN, here are a few places that you can go to. For example, there's a section called Newcomers, and there is a website dedicated to that. There is also ICANN Learn, which is a website resource that you can go to learn about different aspects of ICANN itself and learn at your own pace, basically. And I'll give you the URLs for this a little bit later. And you can also apply to be part of the newcomer program or the fellowship program or the next generation program at ICANN. And the difference between these is that the fellowship and the next gen program, that involves people who are interested applying, and then they are selected, and that they are funded to come to an ICANN meeting, and capacity building or workshops are provided for them to build their capacity to engage at ICANN. That means travel is supported, accommodation and meals, and there is a dedicated program for them. For the newcomer program is that there is no funding, but if you can get yourself to an ICANN meeting, there is a track that you can follow that helps get you on board and to start interacting at ICANN and try to understand it better. Now, the difference between the fellowship and the next gen program is that the fellowship program is targeted at professionals, those who are above 21 years old. There is no age limit, and essentially it's about supporting the participation of those who are interested in becoming part of the ICANN community. And this program, the fellowship, is global, meaning that we accept applications globally for each one of the ICANN meetings. And I will give you the URL next. In terms of the next gen program, this is targeted for those who are still at university, between the ages of 18 and 30. And they need to be enrolled in some type of higher learning curriculum, and there are programs that are dedicated to them. So the fellowship program focuses on capacity building and fast immersion into the ICANN community, and it is very, very competitive and global based. The next gen program is regional based, meaning that if an ICANN meeting is happening in your region, then you may be eligible to participate in the next gen program if you are based in that region and you are enrolled in a higher learning institution. So let's go to the next slide so that I can show you the URLs. Right, so these are the URLs for the fellowship program, the next gen program, and the newcomers program. And then if you were to Google ICANN Learn, it would take you to the site, and basically you have to register, and then you would be able to have access to all the learning materials that are there. And I highly recommend that you just explore it, just to have a sense of it and see what you think. So I think that's all I have in terms of presentation, and if you have questions, I would love to hear them, and if the audio is problematic, perhaps someone could type the questions in the chat and I can address those.
She can. Okay. Your employees, you said 400.
Almost 400.
The average age group. And is there anything being done to...
employees of ICANN? We're doing this from a university, so I'm curious to know how much of the university folks can influence policies, and if something conscious is being done in order to lower the age group, especially because I'm in the internet business myself, and we all know that the age group of the internet users is rapidly decreasing. And I would imagine that we would have a lot of interest as a community to involve more of the youth in policy making.
Right. So thank you for the question. That's why we have the Next Gen program at ICANN. It's basically targeted at young people who might be interested but need a bit more context to understand ICANN and how ICANN works, because before they can interact in a meaningful way. You ask about employees per se, but that's a different category. Employees are not involved in policy making. They are involved in supporting the development of policy. So these are two different categories altogether. So yes, we are focusing on young people. There is a program in place. It probably needs to be scaled up, but it's on the agenda.
Any questions? There's a question from a participant, please name me, and he wants to know, how do you manage your budget for ICANN?
How do we manage our budget? So ICANN has the money is coming from the registration of domain names. So for every registration of top-level domain names, then a certain portion of that, say 20 cents, would come to ICANN to form its revenue or its funding. I think every year the amount itself varies, or it could be anything between 130 million to 160 million. And in terms of the budget development process, that is a process that involves both the ICANN staff as well as the entire community. And the community has a say and to comment on the budget itself and to ask questions. And once it is finalized and approved by the board, then it is implemented and then reviewed again for the following year.
I don't have a question, but if you could repeat the question for the benefit of the audience, because we can't really hear the question. Okay. Rinalia, if you don't mind, some of the participants are asking if you could just repeat the question so that everyone can know what you're answering. We have one more question from...
Yes. So just for the sake of, sharing the question with everybody, I would suggest that we ask the questions in the public and then you can repeat it to the speaker. So my question is...
Can you come here so you can hear it?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello. So I'll just ask my question loudly so the audience can also hear it. My question is, how can we make ICANN more relevant and more localized to Afghanistan, and how can we make ICANN respond more relevantly to our questions, our concerns and our problems? Because although the challenges and questions of internet are rather general and global, but you can understand that we can also have specific country relevant questions and concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And I think that it's really important to have an understanding of the internet governance landscape, because different organizations are responsible for different things. And ICANN has a mission that limits what it can do. And if it goes beyond this mission, then we would be considered as not accountable. For example, ICANN is not responsible for connectivity. It cannot solve your connectivity problems or access problems. What it can address are issues related to domain names policy, building capacity for registries and registrars that help run the domain name system. And you may be interested in having these businesses in your country, and therefore you can ask ICANN to help, and the training is regional. There is a hub in Egypt that basically addresses the entrepreneurship and technical training related to this industry. And in terms of other issues related to, say, rights, these things, some of them are addressed in the ICANN context because they are related to what we do, but most of them stay outside of ICANN's scope. So to make ICANN more relevant to you, we need to know what is of interest and what is of concern and what are your needs. And once we know that, then we need to scope that to see what of those are relevant to what ICANN does. And if it's not relevant to ICANN, then those issues need to be channeled to the other organizations that are working in the area. For example, the Internet Society is very active on issues related to connectivity or content filtering, because ICANN doesn't do content regulation, as an example. I hope that answers your question.
A global platform now where you can refer your questions. And as our speaker said, some of the questions may not directly relate to ICANN, but then they can guide you and refer you to the right authority. So please, she shared the links, membership, links and resources. Please, we would like you to connect to these platforms like ICANN. Thank you.
NITPAA is also at-large structure of ICANN. So in terms of as end users, if you have any concerns or questions or anything, you can come to NITPAA and we can share that with ICANN. Besides that, we also have 2 members in the IDN task force, the internationalized domain name like .alif, although we don't have that TLD, but myself and Qudratullah Waqaf, we are the technical team in terms of giving our input to that task force in order to support languages such as Pashto, Dari, and other languages. But right now, we are only working or providing our feedback on Pashto and Dari. But we also have Turkmen, Uzbeki, and other languages. So if anyone has expertise on those languages, please come and talk to us, and we will help you be part of that task force. We also have a question, Rinalia, about the Arabic Afghanistan. Alif, I know that is not active, but do you have any information on that?
I'm afraid I don't have information on that. If you could just send that to me via email so I can look it up, that would be good.
Okay, Rinalia, thank you very much. We don't have any more questions. Do you have any additional comments to make at the end?
Just final comments to say that I'm very glad that you are organizing this school on internet governance, because I think it's valuable for each country to build the capacity of its citizenry on this, because the internet is the most important infrastructure of our existence, and it's going to continue to be relevant going to the future, and you need to have this capacity in-house, and what I mean by in-house is in your country, to be able to grapple with the issues and to help figure out how your country will develop. And so I'm very pleased, and thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope that my presentation was useful.
It was. Thank you very much, Rinalia. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Production, an innovative media production house.